Our third paper today is the Reverend Lewis Connolly, who's minister at Ipswich Unitarian Meeting House, and his title is The Unchained Spirit, Kenotic Theology and the Unitarian Epic, and he will be exploring Altizerian death of God theology. I think it's important, and I'm very glad that Lewis will be representing a non-theistic approach to the divine, as it's an important part of Christian theology and wider philosophic debates. And so a very warm welcome to Lewis.
But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns. Are we not perpetually falling backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as though through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is it not more and more night coming on all the time? Must not lanterns now be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's to decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. An extract from Friedrich Nietzsche's most notable parable of the madman. When Nietzsche wrote these words in the late 1800s, he was proclaiming the beginning of a new reality in the West. A reality in which the central pillar of people's individual lives and society more broadly was no longer this concept of God. So, was Nietzsche right in making this prophetic pronouncement of God's impending irrelevance? In some respects, it seems like he was entirely wrong. Here we are, over a century later, and in our globalized world, this concept of God in some ways seems just as relevant as ever. And yet, the means by which we do God in the West has irrevocably changed. The concept of God is no longer culturally axiomatic, an assumed aspect of our reality, but rather a concept that one must choose to adopt or buy into. The Western world has undergone a rapid process of secularization and pluralization over the last century. Though individuals may still profess a faith in God, the concept of God is now always approached through the lens of our subjective selves. We choose that reality as opposed to this. Essentially, then, I think there are two responses to this secularizing process. Either we as Unitarians can define ourselves in opposition to it, or we can define secularism as a natural outworking of Christianity, and as such frame our understanding of Christianity not in contention with secularism, but in harmony with it. In brief, this is because I think it is essential as a religious movement that we remain true to the language of faith as we have inherited it as Unitarians. An uncritical adoption of secularism would belie our credentials as a religion, I would suggest. It is essential that we understand ourselves as Unitarians in relation to our Unitarian forebears, and more broadly, to our forebears within the narrative of the Christian epic. To do this, it needs to be understood that our approach to the Christian narrative must be necessarily heretical. As a truly radical and contemporary reading of Christianity cannot, in my opinion, be otherwise. And indeed, if this were not the case, it would weaken our nonconformist credentials. Take the Christian Unitarian leaders of a century ago then, such as James Martineau and Olympia Brown. The Unitarian movement they inhabited bears little resemblance to our own contemporary context. Though we Unitarians often dwell upon our rich heritage, drawing inspiration from these, our illustrious forebears, we struggle to articulate the unfolding narrative of how we got from them to us. In particular, failing to appreciate the extent to which secularization has altered the fabric of our movement. In the last century, there has been a fundamental negation of any shared Unitarian theological identity. It's completely fallen away. The emergent, amorphic movement we're left with today, as a consequence of this change, is having its own sort of existential crisis. Unable to adequately articulate a collective theological identity, assuming that in some sense to be desirable, we have been thrust into a new context in which we feel uneasy with ourselves and unsure even how to proceed, how to go forward from here. What I aim to do in this paper then is nothing less than offer a narrative that makes sense of the seismic shift our movement has undergone over the last century. A narrative which reframes our movement and its sense of identity within the broader Christian epic narrative, though as stated in a wholly heretical fashion. So returning to Nietzsche. He was a devastating critic of dogmatic Christianity. Though in many ways a paradoxical thinker, we can nevertheless get a hold to some extent on what he understood by the death of God. For Nietzsche, it was the coherent framework of dogmatic Christianity which resulted in the necessary intellectual tools which could in turn displace Christianity. Nietzsche is often writing in grand terms, which often come closer to poetry or mythological prose, not unlike Dante, John Milton, and indeed the Bible itself. This more artistic or mystic approach allows Nietzsche to mediate a space between what we know, what we are able to articulate, and what we don't know, what is a realm of knowledge beyond our immediate conception. Christianity, then, developed a conception of the spirit of truth, which in turn undermined the central claims of Christianity. The undermining is the death of God, an apocalyptic horizon of no return, out of which there can be a potential burgeoning of a whole new tomorrow. For Nietzsche, the God of Christianity, as he saw it, was a destructive, life-denying force in our world, a force which causes us to deny our very humanity and long for a beyond which isn't even there. For Nietzsche, God was like a large, transcendent enemy, an enemy of all that was good in humanity, all the fullness and passion of human life. Only through God's death can humanity be liberated from these oppressive shackles and find its true liberty and joy again. Within this apocalyptic clearing of all prior certainties, there emerges a new space for a new creative eruption. As Nietzsche says, the sacred is in decomposition. God is decomposing. In other words, there is an unfolding process of gradual comprehension. God is dead, but the true possibilities within that death are only just beginning to be realized. For Nietzsche, given the now realized absence of our transcendent groundedness, a chaotic clearing opens before us. As the world's various creation myths have us emerge out of a primordial chaos infused with potential, so now we return to that primordial chaos and the possibility of a new dawn. The radical theologian Thomas J.J. Altizer, somewhat counterintuitively, wants to understand Friedrich Nietzsche's insight here, not in opposition to Christianity, but rather as echoing Christianity's radically apocalyptic message. In this way, Altizer affirms Nietzsche as a contemporary Christian prophet. To regard Nietzsche in this way suggests a reading of Christianity somewhat at variance with the mainstream. When we talk of Christianity, what are we talking about? It is the religion of a shunned and despised Jewish rabbi. From its conception, the church has been a theologically diverse community of people proclaiming a radical message of love. The difficulty when it comes to Christian theology is that it emerges out of a combative dialectical process, and as such, it has to have winners and losers. The orthodox mainstream takes the rather naively optimistic view that out of this combative process, those who emerge as the victors must necessarily be the good guys. The absurdity of this belief sits in stark contrast alongside the fact that the focus of Christianity is a person who made a point of standing with the losers, the outcasts, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, a man who literally died at the hands of the tyrannical majority. As Christianity was transformed into an imperial religion, its truly radical impulse seeped away. As such, I take it as a given that Orthodox theology and Christendom itself, birthed forth from such orthodoxy, is necessarily inadequate, and perhaps more than that, an insidious force, echoing Nietzsche's conception of the Christian God, the purveyor of human misery. What is required, then, is for us to reach back into the fragments of Christian theology and allow something new to emerge, to evaluate the central claims of Christianity, most significantly, the central events of Christianity, the incarnation and crucifixion of Jesus. Despite the tenets of classic Unitarianism, the crux of the epic Christian narrative is surely the incarnation and crucifixion of Jesus. Though it's perfectly valid, of course, to question the objective reality of such events, as I obviously would, they take a place of primacy when informing the Christian imagination. It is necessary, then, to draw a distinction between the way the world shows up to us, our human experience, and the objective world. We mustn't overlook the fact that the Passion of Christ sits at the very center of the synoptic gospel tradition, and that Paul sees the possibility of the new creation arising out of the ending or death of the old creation, an ending Paul sees manifested in the crucifixion. The horrific and offensive crucifixion formed the basis and impetus of the Christian faith. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Though I would certainly want to resist reducing Jesus' ministry to just his coming and going, and echo something of the radical Reformation, Anabaptist tradition, and the mystical tradition as they elevate his life and teachings. Despite that, I think in mythological terms, the crucifixion itself cannot be overlooked. As we consider then what a robust theological treatment of the cross might look like, we encounter the inadequate Unitarian treatment of the cross from a century ago, articulated none other than by James Martineau, whose theology had its heyday in the late 19th century, and it still lingers on to some extent today. Given that the cross event is the very core of the Christian epic, then, it should strike us as deeply problematic if the event cannot be integrated into our theological understanding, into our theological schema. How, then, are we to understand the cross as Unitarians? I would summarize James Martineau's theological treatment of the cross and the crucifixion in the following way. Jesus was, like you and I, a human being who had a divine mission to reconcile first the Jews and then all of humanity to God. As a Hebrew man living in the first century Israel, he was restricted in his mission by time and space. But through his death upon the cross, in quitting his mortal body, his spirit was able to, in effect, become immortal and, more than that, universal. His prophetic message could be carried by his people across seas, cultural and national barriers to every corner of the earth. In this way, the cross opened the message of Jesus to the nations, his blessed way after the love of God. The death of Jesus, then, as far as Martineau was concerned, was not to be imbued with any metaphysical significance in and of itself. It was not, for example, to be seen as a ransom for the sinful state of humanity or fulfilling some kind of predetermined plan from on high. We are, as such, all called to be his messengers, to impart his truth and to project it out into the world. The cross, in Martineau's theology, merely universalizes Jesus' message. In the late 80s and early 90s, the comic book writer Alan Moore developed a new graphic novel called V for Vendetta, which was later adapted in 2005 into a movie starring Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman. It's set in a near-future dystopian Britain ruled by a nationalistic, immigration and Muslim-hating police state. In this bleak and repressive society, the only beacon of hope is a vigilante wearing a Guy Fawkes mask, who orchestrates an elaborate and theatrical plot to bring down the fascist state. He stands up in the face of oppression for fairness, justice, and freedom. In a particularly harrowing scene in the movie, V withstands a barrage of bullets, and exasperated, his opponent cries, "Why won't you die?" To which V replies, "Beneath this mask is more than flesh. Beneath this mask there is an idea, Mr. Creedy, and ideas are bulletproof." I believe this idea captures perfectly the Unitarian Martineau-esque view of Jesus. The pertinent issue is not so much that he died, but that behind the man there is an idea, a bulletproof idea. And that idea, in Jesus' case, is love, the sacrificial love of God, the sisterhood and brotherhood of humanity, and our individual affinity before God. Jesus points the way towards the kingdom of peace, and therefore we act as his hands and feet on earth, striving to make that a reality, first in our hearts and then ultimately in the world. Now, I have several problems with this reading of the Christian epic. Chief among which, this view of Jesus affirms the God of progress, the God of liberal values, the God of peace and kindness, all things which on the surface we would of course want to affirm. But the trouble is it robs the crucifixion of any significance in and of itself. It affirms a trajectory towards wholeness and completeness which it ultimately cannot deliver. It gives us a palatable way to frame the crucifixion, and it makes it all about our progressive ideals. It clarifies our place and purpose within the universe far too comfortably. The death of Jesus on the cross cannot be affirmed as significant because it merely lends weight to what we already know to be true. The crucifixion is supposed to be understood as an affront that ruptures our received wisdom. This Martineau-esque view underplays the significance of Jesus' death and fails to help us make sense of the secularizing trends which have swept across our culture and our movement. Now, there's a distinct difficulty of talking about Jesus within our movement, as we so often, as Unitarians, fall down a reductive rabbit hole, obsessing over historical particularities, such as the fact that he was just a man, who lived 2,000 years ago, failing to grasp his mythological significance, which far outweighs such facts. Liberal theology in general, over the last century, has fixated upon questions of Jesus' historicity to the exclusion of Jesus as he has inhabited the Christian imagination. To participate in the subjective reality of Jesus has little to do with such alleged historical events. In as far as Jesus manifests in the present as a yes to life, he is not the historical figure of academic inquiry, but a revelation of the sacred, a revelation which reveals subjectively new emergent possibilities, possibilities which can even go beyond the biblical tradition. To illustrate this point, the radical theologian Thomas J.J. Altizer often looks to the poetry of William Blake, quoting Jerusalem. "Awake, awake, O sleeper of the land of shadows. Wake, expand, I am in you and you in me, mutual love divine. Fibers of love from man to man, through Albion's pleasant land. I am not God afar off. I am brother and friend within your bosom. I reside, and you reside in me." Here, Blake's transcendent Jesus, walking through this pleasant land, England, obviously goes beyond the biblical tradition. In Blake's poetry, the image of Jesus embodies the very breadth of the human imagination. Jesus is an immediate expression of love presently actualized. It's all about our present reality, not a future or a past reality. It's worth contrasting Blake's transcendent Jesus, his yes to life, with Nietzsche's perception of the God of our retrograde past, that oppressive alien other whose death would liberate our human potential. Here, the theology of incarnation in Blake's poetry is not a single event in time, but an ongoing process, brought to bear by the Christian imagination. The incarnation being the divine spark, being the divine taking on flesh or emptying himself into the present. Again, this is not to make an historical claim, but express an experiential reality. Blake provides a poetic vision of the incarnation, but in a more radical sense, an incarnational theology in which God enters the world in the present, wholly and without remainder. Thomas J.J. Altizer is a fascinating theologian, an American radical theologian who's been publishing all the way through from the 1960s to now. His theology draws heavily upon continental theology, particularly the work of Georg Hegel, as it builds upon Friedrich Nietzsche. He sees the real work of theology's ongoing process not in Christian academia, but rather in culture. He'd far sooner look to the work of Milton, Blake, or Joyce to elucidate the radical core of Christianity rather than to other Christian theologians. We shouldn't be surprised that fictional narratives are able to enter the hinterland of our knowing more easily than straight rational inquiry or systematic theology. As stated, the arts, broadly defined, are able to capture something otherwise not easily articulated. This is why I believe radical theology for today almost always begins with culture, film, literature, poetry. Altizer then, in his most notable and infamous book, The Gospel of Christian Atheism, attempts to construct a radical doctrine of the incarnation with the use of the concept of kenosis. Kenosis, which means self-emptying, is a concept used by theologians to try and understand the incarnation, that the divine logos will kenosis, or self-empty, into flesh. The Greek word appears in Philippians 2:7, where the passage reads, Jesus emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave. It's kenosis, as understood by Hegel, that Altizer uses to construct his theology of hyper-incarnation, which finds poetic expression in Blake's poetry. Now, Jörg Hegel's conception of kenosis relates closely to what I've already spoken about in relation to Nietzsche's chaotic clearing. Nietzsche's death of God, that negation of one reality, prior certainties, to birth and realize the next. For Hegel, then, there must be a dissolution of one reality for the emergence of a new possibility through a forward movement process. I'll summarize Altizer's theology then. He believes the theological assertion of God is dead, or the death of God, in fact gets us back to a more primal form of Christianity. This assertion points us towards a mythological claim that in some sense God did once inhabit the skies. God showed up to our ancestors as a certainty, and that through the incarnation, God's enfleshment in Jesus and ultimate death on the cross resulted in just that, God's death in our world, to impart himself redemptively to this world, not holding himself back from this world or having his divinity re-established after the events of Holy Week. The ultimate transcendent ground has therefore ceased to exist. Dying to make a primal reconciliation with the world possible, God has died in Christ. Incarnational theology is only realized if it is absolute. Partial incarnation, on the other hand, is evidently not incarnation at all. Kenosis, then, according to Hegel, is a process of negation, a process by which the ground of being becomes increasingly incarnated into the world, into flesh and into physical matter. In psychoanalytical terms, you can think of it like this: we confront that which is our greatest fear head on, that there is no ground of reality, that there is no God, and that wholeness as a human being lies in our acceptance of reality, of this reality. This is not an idolatrous claim. We do not put ourselves above God and declare his death. God itself empties itself as a loving, self-sacrificial act, that the divinity of God might rest here, divinizing humanity itself. This move subverts all questions of the transcendent and relocates them all within the infinite present. In 2014, Brendan Gleeson was in a movie called Calvary, in which Gleeson plays a priest in Ireland named Father James, a clear-thinking, well-intentioned priest overseeing a parish of incredibly dysfunctional people. The film begins with Father James being told anonymously in a confessional that he will die for the sins of another priest, despite being a good priest himself. One character sacrificing him or herself for some greater perceived good is, of course, a recurring theme in fiction, and that's exactly what happens here in Calvary. Throughout the film, which mirrors closely the unfolding events of Holy Week, we move towards the inevitable death of Father James, a death which, as Jesus shows, acts to reconcile people to God. There is a sense that Father James is not dying needlessly, but sacrificially for his parishioners, that somehow the collective evil of all of them, or perhaps even society itself, will be redeemed in his death. As the film unfolds, we, the audience, are invited to consider who we think the would-be murderer is, though ultimately we're brought to a place where this question becomes incidental, for his act of cruelty is merely a manifestation of the pain or sickness of our age. That kind of mirrors what Jesus says on the cross. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Through the film, though the film strongly emphasizes the Christian narrative motif, it does so in contemporary terms. There's no nod to supernaturalism whatsoever. Father James simply articulates a selfless theology of love. He says, I think there is far too much talk about sin, to be honest, and not enough talk about virtue. I think forgiveness has been highly underrated. His modeling of forgiveness is the ultimate expression of love, a love which is not contained, but supersedes his span of life. It is, if you like, the protagonist's resurrection. His spirit of forgiveness is uncontainable, undefined by death. It's not incidental, I don't believe, that a contemporary recasting of the Christian gospel, as this film certainly is, eliminates the resurrection. Indeed, if it transpired at the very end of the movie that Brendan Gleeson was, surprise, impervious to bullets, the movie would have not been able to carry its message, underscoring the redemptive power of love. Father James confronts his death head on, accepts it, and through accepting it, there's a transformative effect on those around him. This captures Altizer's theology, that in the absence of divine assurance, all that remains is the manifesting of love wholly in the immediate present. I believe within our own movement, at least subconsciously, we are now wholly within the realm of accepting the absence of any transcendent groundedness. This explains the loosening and widening our movement has undergone over the last century. As a result, the amorphic movement has entered spheres of spiritual inquiry previously unimaginable, certainly unimaginable to those Unitarian ministers of a century ago. We have become unhinged from one another, so adrift upon the sea of curiosity that we can no longer even conceptualize a framework which could encompass us all. Now, this isn't wholly without merit. There is value in affirming our togetherness despite our spiritual diversity. The trouble is we become so displaced, we lose sight even of our origins and become existentially adrift, unable to affirm any mutual cause. Plurality itself is wholly inadequate as a signifier of our identity. Pluralism for the sake of pluralism is spiritually bankrupt and has clearly failed in its attempt to become the central spoke of this movement. There's a fine line between spiritual creativity and random expressions of hollow spirituality. The difference is that Nietzsche's creative versioning only makes sense as an outworking from a previously established rigidity. A process of spiritual exploration has to be a movement out from an initial place of origin. Our movement emerges out from the Christian epic narrative, yes, but more than that, it emerges out from the mythological assertion that any transcendent groundedness has ceased to exist. There can be no metaphysical conception which unifies the Unitarian movement as a whole. Finally, then, our movement then is this: a series of spokes spiraling out from a central hub. And that central hub is God in decomposition. It is a troubling image, but one, I believe, that does wholly encompass the movement. And more than that, wholly makes sense of the last century. The challenge for us is not to be repelled by such an image, but recognize the freedom and creative possibility such an image affords us. We confront this horrific reality to be released into a new possibility. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Thank you.